This story doesn't begin with a handshake or a treaty signing. It begins with anger, disbelief, and a rupture so deep that it has shaken the foundations of a military alliance that has existed for 77 years. Just days after what many diplomats are already calling the most violent diplomatic clash in NATO's history, the world woke up to a new reality. Following President Trump's incendiary remarks accusing NATO allies of staying off the front lines in Afghanistan, the alliance has not merely been weakened, it has been frozen in place. This isn't a symbolic breakdown. Leaders across Europe are not venting frustration through statements or press conferences. They are acting quietly, methodically, and with purpose. What we are witnessing is not a loud confrontation, but a calculated separation. A strategic rerouting of power, trade, and trust that bypasses Washington altogether. The idea that NATO is broken is no longer a future risk or an analyst's theory. As of today, it is the operating condition of the Western world. The United States is in the process of pulling out of 66 international organizations. Tariffs as high as 41% are now hitting the very allies that once formed the backbone of American global influence. And instead of responding with military threats or political ultimatums, those allies have answered with something far more consequential: agreements, contracts, and signatures on paper. This video goes deep into that response. We will break down the exact terms of the EU-India deal finalized today, explain the specific remarks that pushed the United Kingdom and Germany to openly turn away from the White House and confront the uncomfortable economic future facing an increasingly isolated America in 2026. This is not a theory. This is the story of how the West began to move on without the United States. To understand why European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are smiling in New Delhi today, we first need to understand why anger is boiling over in London and Berlin. The trigger for this shift wasn't a leaked memo or a classified report. It was a sentence spoken on live television. Last Thursday, during an appearance on Fox Business, President Trump made a claim that stunned diplomats and veterans alike. While defending his isolationist policies and renewed threats to withdraw from NATO, he suggested that America's allies, countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and Poland, had stayed slightly behind, away from the front lines, while U.S. forces bore the real burden of fighting in Afghanistan. In one moment, decades of shared sacrifice were brushed aside. The response was immediate and explosive. For the first time in generations, a British Prime Minister publicly condemned a sitting U.S. president with raw, visible anger. Sir Keir Starmer called the remarks appalling and deeply insulting, signaling that this was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over quietly. The fury was not emotional overreaction. It was rooted in facts, and those facts are what made the damage irreversible. The United Kingdom lost 457 service members in Afghanistan. Canada lost 158. Germany lost 59. Denmark, when measured per capita, suffered some of the heaviest losses in the entire coalition. These forces were not stationed safely behind the lines. They fought in Helmand province. They operated in Kandahar. They died under the same conditions, facing the same risks, and bleeding in the same dust as American Marines. When those sacrifices were dismissed as secondary or distant, it cut straight to the core of the alliance. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius broke long-standing diplomatic norms by addressing the issue directly on national television. Speaking on ARD, he demanded a formal apology, stating clearly that it was wrong and disrespectful to talk about the deaths of Allied soldiers in that way. He emphasized that rewriting history for political convenience does not change the truth. This was no longer about wounded pride. It was about trust collapsing in public view. At the heart of NATO is Article 5, the promise that an attack on one member is an attack on all. That promise only works if allies believe their sacrifices are recognized and valued. When the President of the United States dismisses the lives lost by British and German troops as evidence of lesser commitment, he sends a dangerous message. He signals that their blood carries less weight. And if their sacrifices are seen as disposable, then the alliance itself becomes negotiable. This realization spread quickly across European capitals. Leaders began to understand that this was not a temporary storm. They simply needed to endure until the political weather changed. It was a structural shift, a permanent condition. If the US president does not respect the cost Europe has already paid, there is little reason to believe he would honor future obligations. The insult did more than offend. It forced a reckoning. Europe began to accept that waiting was no longer an option, adapting was, and that realization set off a chain reaction that would reshape global alliances almost overnight. Once that trust snapped, everything that had been moving slowly suddenly accelerated. Years of cautious diplomacy were replaced by urgency. Europe understood that if NATO's foundation was cracking and the transatlantic trade bridge was already burning under new tariffs, 25% on steel, 15% on automobiles, then waiting for stability from Washington was no longer a viable strategy. The realization was stark and uncomfortable. If the United States no longer valued European blood, it would not reliably defend European borders either. That moment of clarity transformed long-stalled negotiations with India into a full sprint. Europe didn't just need a backup plan. It needed a partner large enough, stable enough, and independent enough to anchor a new economic and strategic order. When European leaders looked east, they didn't see uncertainty, they saw opportunity. They saw the world's most populous democracy growing fast, politically assertive, and ready to deal. That is why January 27th, 2026 matters. While Washington remained locked in debates over tariffs and withdrawals, Brussels and New Delhi finalized a trade agreement that had been discussed, delayed, and revived repeatedly for nearly 2 decades. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a modest upgrade. The European Commission described it as the largest and most ambitious trade agreement it had ever signed, and the numbers released this morning support that claim. This deal does not tweak the global system. It redraws it. What emerged is a free trade zone covering more than 2 billion people, effectively integrating huge portions of the Eurasian Rim while leaving the United States outside the circle. Tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India are being eliminated. For a country known for aggressively protecting its domestic markets, this is extraordinary. India does not open its economy easily. But for Europe, the barriers didn't just come down. They disappeared. Nowhere is this shift more visible than in the automotive sector. For decades, selling European cars in India was almost impossible at scale. German and Italian manufacturers faced tariffs as high as 110%, a level designed to keep foreign vehicles out entirely. Under the new agreement, that barrier collapses to just 10%. For Germany's auto industry, this is nothing short of a lifeline. Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW have been squeezed hard by US tariffs that have made the American market less profitable and less predictable. With one signature, they have effectively exchanged a slowing US consumer base for a rapidly expanding Indian middle class. And this isn't limited to luxury vehicles. The ripple effects stretch across Europe's industrial core. Wine and spirits, long burdened by Indian tariffs of up to 150%, will now flow at a fraction of the cost. Heavy machinery, once hit with 44% duties, gains access overnight. Chemical products lose their 22% penalty. Pharmaceuticals, one of Europe's strongest export sectors, enter with minimal resistance. In exchange, India receives tariff-free access for 99% of its exports into the European Union. Textiles, leather goods, jewelry industries that employ millions of Indian workers now move directly into markets like Paris, Berlin, and Rome without the tax barriers that once slowed them down. The symmetry of the timing is impossible to ignore. As Indian exporters are hit with new reciprocal US tariffs ranging from 25 to 40%, Europe's market opens wide. As European manufacturers face a 15% wall in the United States, India becomes fully accessible. This is not coincidence, it is strategy. What we are seeing is a classic pincer movement in global trade. 2 massive democratic economies, measured by population and combined economic output, are insulating themselves against the unpredictability of a third. In New Delhi, Ursula von der Leyen did not hide the message. She stated plainly that this agreement sends a signal to the world that rules-based cooperation still works and still produces results. That signal was not abstract. It was directed squarely at Washington. The message could not be clearer. Europe and India do not need American approval to thrive. They can design prosperity without it. And with the ink now dry, that message has moved from rhetoric into reality. The title of this video mentions a ban, and that word matters because what is unfolding is not an official expulsion written into law. No one is formally voting to remove the United States from NATO or the World Trade Organization. That process would be slow, messy, and legally complex. But geopolitics rarely works through formal eviction notices. Power shifts through behavior, through exclusion, through silence. A soft ban does not require paperwork. It happens when allies quietly stop sharing intelligence because they no longer trust the judgment of your president. It takes shape when shipping lanes and trade routes are redesigned to avoid your ports. It becomes visible when global summits turn into a G6+1, where real decisions are made in private before the American delegation even enters the room. This is not theory. It is happening now, in real time. And the EU-India deal is one of its clearest signals. As Europe deepens its integration with India, the United States is moving in the opposite direction, retreating into an increasingly strange form of isolation. President Trump has launched what he calls the Board of Peace, a new international forum that notably includes Vladimir Putin while excluding many traditional Western allies. At the same time, the US has withdrawn from 66 international organizations in just the past year, dismissing them as vehicles for globalist agendas. The result of this retreat is not independence. It is irrelevance. While Washington steps back, the rest of the world reorganizes. Europe, in particular, has stopped talking about strategic autonomy as a distant goal. For years, the phrase floated through Brussels as an abstract concept, a polite way of saying Europe should someday learn to stand on its own. Today, it has become a survival strategy. The EU-India agreement goes far beyond trade. Buried within its chapters is a serious framework for defense and security cooperation. This is where the implications grow even more profound. Europe and India are not just exchanging cars and wine. They are coordinating on maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. They are sharing approaches to cybersecurity. They are discussing stability in regions that were once the exclusive domain of US-led conversations. These are discussions that used to take place in Washington-backed forums under American leadership. Now they are happening without it. India, for its part, is also adjusting its strategic posture. For years, it played a central role in the Quad alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia in a structure designed to counterbalance China. But unpredictability changes alliances. As Washington imposes tariffs on Indian goods, threatens visa restrictions, and oscillates between partnership and pressure, New Delhi is hedging its bets. From India's perspective, deeper alignment with Europe offers stability without the volatility. Europe doesn't demand loyalty tests. It offers access, investment, and shared rules. The calculation is pragmatic. A long-term partnership with Brussels appears safer than tying India's future to the political swings of MAGA-driven policy. This shift does not mean India is abandoning old relationships overnight, but it does mean that American influence is no longer central. It is one option among many. And when a country of 1.45 billion people reaches that conclusion, the global balance shifts. For American viewers, or anyone watching the global economy, the cost of this isolation is not abstract. It shows up in prices, jobs, and lost opportunities. President Trump argues that tariffs will force companies to bring production back to the United States, framing the strategy as a great rebuilding. To support that claim, he often points to the massive $550 billion investment pledge announced by Japan in July 2025. On paper, it sounds transformative. But economists have repeatedly warned that such pledges are fragile. They are promises, not factories. When economic conditions tighten or political winds change, these commitments can evaporate. Meanwhile, the immediate effect of tariffs is far more concrete. Prices rise. A 25% tariff on imports does not disappear. It lands directly on consumers. The deeper danger, however, lies in market access. American farmers, particularly soybean growers in Iowa and corn producers in Nebraska, depend heavily on exports. Their survival is tied to overseas buyers. When Europe and India eliminate tariffs between themselves, those American producers are pushed outside the circle. A French farmer can now sell wheat to India without paying a tax. An American farmer cannot. Faced with that choice, Indian buyers will follow the map. This phenomenon is known as trade diversion, and it is one of the most effective ways to weaken a dominant economy without firing a single shot. It works quietly over time as markets shift and habits form. Once buyers establish new supply chains, they rarely return. The EU-India agreement gives European companies a powerful first-mover advantage in a market that represents the future of global consumption. With a population of roughly 1.45 billion people and a rapidly expanding middle class, India is not just another trading partner. It is the growth engine of the next several decades. European brands will now establish themselves early, locking in relationships, shelf space, and consumer loyalty long before American companies even get a chance to negotiate similar access. By the time Washington attempts to repair ties or propose its own deal, the market will already be saturated with German appliances, French luxury goods, Italian food products, and European pharmaceuticals. This is how economic influence is lost, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual exclusion. By 2030, trade flowing between Europe and India is projected to double. At the same time, U.S. trade with Europe is expected to shrink by roughly 15% as the tariff standoff drags on. This is not speculation, it is arithmetic. Superpower status erodes when others stop needing you, and this unraveling cannot be understood without addressing what sounds almost absurd, but has played a serious role in widening the NATO fracture. The Greenland crisis, while it may appear comedic on the surface, it has become a significant stress point in transatlantic relations. President Trump has revived his push to purchase Greenland from Denmark, a proposal Copenhagen has already rejected multiple times. When Denmark refused, again, tensions escalated quickly. Tariffs were threatened against a loyal NATO ally. This was not simply about territory, it was about the Arctic. As polar ice melts, new shipping routes and access to untapped resources are opening. Control over that region carries enormous strategic weight, but the method mattered. By pressuring Denmark publicly, the United States alarmed the entire Nordic region. Sweden, Finland, and Norway have watched these developments closely, and their conclusion has been sobering. Instead of viewing the U.S. as a reliable protector, they are increasingly concerned it may act unpredictably, even aggressively, toward its own allies. That fear has pushed Nordic countries deeper into European Union-led defense initiatives and further away from U.S.-centered NATO structures. Each move adds another layer to America's isolation. None of this happens in a vacuum. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, especially when it is broken repeatedly. Looking ahead, history may very well mark January 2026 as a turning point. This is the moment when Europe and India, two pillars of the Eurasian Rim, chose to link arms and quietly close the gate on Atlantic dominance. President Trump promised to put America first, and in a narrow sense, he has delivered. America now stands alone, first in tariffs, first in withdrawal, first in isolation. But last, in the rooms where the future is being negotiated, there is no official document announcing America's exclusion, no vote casting the United States out of NATO. But when allies build new economic systems without you, when they sign the largest agreements in modern history in your absence, and when they demand accountability for insults directed at their fallen soldiers, the outcome is the same. The EU-India deal is signed, the terms are locked in, tariffs are rising, barriers are solidifying. This is the new global landscape, and it is far less forgiving than the one that came before. For the first time in over a century, the United States is navigating the world largely on its own. The shift is quiet, but its consequences are loud, and they are only beginning to surface. This story is still unfolding, and its full consequences will not be visible overnight. The EU-India agreement may be signed, but the economic shockwaves it will generate are only starting to move through global markets. Supply chains will realign, investment will follow stability, political priorities will shift, and the response from Washington is unlikely to be reconciliation. Based on current signals, more tariffs are expected within days, not months. That is the pattern we have seen repeat itself. Pressure instead of partnership, retaliation instead of repair, but every additional tariff, every further withdrawal accelerates the same outcome. The world adapts, and it does so without waiting for American approval. Deals are signed in rooms where the United States is no longer central, sometimes not even present. For American viewers, this raises a difficult question about cost and consequence. Isolation is often framed as strength, as independence from a broken system, but independence becomes expensive when it cuts you off from the fastest growing markets on Earth. Higher prices at home are only the first layer. The deeper cost is lost leverage. When other nations build rules, standards, and trade networks without you, re-entry becomes harder with each passing year. Influence is not something you can pause and restart at will. Once competitors establish dominance, they defend it fiercely. The EU-India corridor is doing exactly that, setting norms, pricing structures, and long-term supply commitments that favor insiders and penalize outsiders. The United States is increasingly finding itself in that outer ring. There is also a psychological shift underway among America's traditional allies. The silence between world leaders is becoming as meaningful as their public statements. Phone calls go unanswered. Invitations arrive late or not at all. Decisions are made elsewhere and then announced as fate's accomplice. This is how a soft ban feels in practice. Not confrontation, but marginalization. Not hostility, but distance. It is the realization that the world no longer orbits around Washington's approval. The Greenland episode, the Afghanistan remarks, the tariff escalations, and the mass withdrawal from institutions are not isolated events. Together, they form a pattern that allies can no longer ignore. Trust does not collapse in one moment. It erodes through repetition. As we move deeper into 2026, the question is no longer whether American dominance is being challenged. That question has already been answered. The real question is whether the United States chooses to adapt or double down. Rebuilding alliances requires humility, acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, and a willingness to engage on equal terms. Burning bridges may feel powerful in the moment, but history shows that nations rarely thrive alone for long. Power in the modern world is networked. It flows through cooperation as much as competition. When those networks are severed, even the strongest economies feel the strain. So we arrive at the uncomfortable crossroads this moment represents. Did the United States walk away from its allies, or did its allies decide they could no longer rely on it? Is this soft ban the beginning of the end of U.S. hegemony, or a temporary phase that will be corrected through political change and renewed diplomacy? Supporters argue that demanding more from allies was long overdue, even if it meant risking relationships. Critics warn that the cost of that gamble may be permanent. The EU-India deal stands as proof that the world does not stand still while America debates its identity. It moves forward with or without U.S. leadership. This is why this story matters and why we are continuing to track it closely. The money flows, the treaties being drafted, and the quiet spaces where leaders once spoke openly all tell the same story. The global order is shifting not with explosions, but with signatures. If you want to stay ahead of these changes, make sure you are subscribed. We will keep following the deals, the data, and the decisions shaping what comes next. And now we turn it over to you. Is this the inevitable price of putting America first, or a strategic mistake that future generations will struggle to undo? Share your thoughts below.